Hi, hello, welcome back. Hope you have a cup of tea ready as we are about to dive into a whole new world today. In this episode of Textery, we are getting piping hot tea from classic old Hollywood. I am so excited about this because I have watched a lot of old Hollywood films in my lifetime, not only during the course of my film studies, but just in general. And there is a lot of old stars I just admire. There is a lot of old stars that I feel like I could be friends with. And what better way to verify that than to read recollections of people that actually met them? Not gonna lie, they just don't make them like they used to. And I don't just mean the stars, but I also mean the old dudes that are writing their memoirs. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of old stars or people that were involved in the Hollywood industry that published the most ridiculous memoirs or diaries or just their memories written down of what it was like back then. And they were ruthless. So today we are reading the memoirs of Orry-Kelly. Orry-Kelly was an Australian-born costume designer. He has worked on films such as Some Like It Hot, on Casablanca. He designed costumes for An American in Paris. So his filmography is so long. He moved to the US to pursue a career in acting. And he lived in New York in an apartment with Cary Grant, who was his friend at first, but then he was kind of in a relationship with him. But it was on again, off again, according to his descriptions. And he never outwardly says that he was his boyfriend, but you can kind of guess it from what he was writing. Anyway, the acting career didn't quite work out for him. It did work out for Cary Grant, obviously. But Orry-Kelly instead started designing for Broadway. And then after moving to Hollywood, he became a chief costume designer at Warner Bros. And that was his job for like several years. I think maybe even 2 decades. So the memoirs that we will be reading today were only discovered recently. Apparently, they were discovered in a pillowcase, but that's about the only information I was able to find about the memoirs. They were published in 2015, and I have to say they are a little chaotic, and I'm thinking that the fact that they were hidden and the fact that they weren't published before maybe meant that they weren't meant to be published, or maybe meant that he did not think them good enough to be published. But one thing he definitely did right was describe the stars that he got to work with. So it's all obviously very personal and very subjective, but I do find it fascinating to read people's accounts of famous actors and actresses, simply because they just differ so much from what we are used to. You know, we are seeing those people on screen, but what was Bette Davis actually like? What were all those famous people, Barbara Stanwyck, Joan Crawford, what were they actually like? So he, in his memoirs, paints a picture of Hollywood that is glamorous, that is a little self-obsessed, I would say. A little bit like it's all about who knows who. It is full of eccentric characters. So in a way, it probably is a little bit like Hollywood nowadays, but I feel like modern day Hollywood is full of themselves, probably the same amount as people back then were, but they're putting out worse stuff, so they have less reasons to be so proud of themselves. Anyway, that's my personal opinion, but we will be focusing mainly on his recollections of working with famous Hollywood actresses. So if you have an old Hollywood favorite, this might be really interesting for you. The first description that we'll be reading is that of Loretta Young. Loretta Young was a famous 1930s actress. You definitely know her if you are into 1930s movies. There was a whole bunch of them, actually. There was like 4 or 5 sisters, I don't remember now, but all of them were actresses or trying to make it in Hollywood, but she's the one that actually broke through and became the most famous one. Loretta Young was very young when I designed my first motion picture dress in 1932. It was a B picture, but it broke the ice for me and almost my heart. The one evening dress I was proud of and liked, she didn't. It was thrown out of the picture. Later, I was told she bought it at a half price. Not wanting to have it ruined under the hot arc lights, she pretended not to like it. It was really a compliment to me, but at the time I didn't think so. This is actually really funny. So she liked the costume so much that she was like, I actually hate it. Can I buy it, by the way? So an actress that he describes a lot and he has fond memories of is Kay Francis, and I'm so happy that she was nice to him because she's probably one of my favorite 1930s actresses apart from Norma Shearer, and I'm just so happy that she wasn't a bitch. Here's how he describes her, and it's exactly what I thought it would be. My first assignment with Kay Francis was One Way Passage. William Powell was her co-star. I think it was the best picture she ever made for Warner's. It took me several years to know this very down-to-earth, genuinely nice person. During the 8 years I dressed her, we had no misunderstandings. She was well-mannered, cooperative, easy to please, and knew exactly what she wanted. She became known as the best-dressed woman on screen. To be fair, I think he mentions that about like 2 other actresses as well, but maybe it was in different time periods. One of the few frugal stars, Kay Francis lived behind the Sunset Towers in a tiny house where the rent was $75 a month. Some years later, I couldn't help overhearing Kay returning the telephone call of a big star who had squandered all of her money after leaving Warner's. The fallen star was still living in the Grand Manor at the Pierre Hotel in New York. I heard Kay say, "Now don't worry, dear. I'll send you $5,000 in the morning." Not only was she generous and understanding in this way, but she liked and helped little people. She bought a Ford for Ida, her little old wardrobe woman. Why is he so hung up on the word little? Like, just because someone works below you on set doesn't mean they're smaller, but okay. Starting with Kay Francis, I designed simple, unadorned evening gowns. Black velvet, wide, beige, and black chiffon or crepe. I introduced what was the forerunner of the shirt maker dress for evening. Taking the daytime sport lines with kick pleats, I dropped these to the ground, using tailored arrowheads where the inverted pleats meet. At first, only those with sensitive tastes were impressed. Luckily, Kay was the essence of good taste. Hell yeah, Kay Francis! Not only was she beautiful, but she was also nice and a good person. Hell yeah. Another person he describes in a really nice, I think, manner is Joan Blondell. Now, I wasn't really familiar with her until like a year or 2 ago, but she is so funny. Go watch movies with her, especially those that are pre-code, so pre-1933. They are so funny. She is so hilarious. She is the OG queen of like face comedy. Like just the faces she makes are so hilarious. And this is how he describes her. When I first set eyes on Joan in 1932, she looked like a beautiful big Cupid doll out of a penny arcade. Everything about Joan was rounded, from her top to her bottom. Big glass blue eyes shone from under her tousled golden brown hair. When she smiled, her round dimpled cheeks set off her capless pearly teeth. The nape of her neck was salt cellarless. 2 rose-pink buds swelled from her bosom like full-blown cabbage roses. No wonder she was nicknamed Rosebud when in her teens she won a Texas beauty contest. Like all rounded figures and naughty French postcards, she looked better in the altogether. Clothes cluttered her up or down. I had my troubles dressing her. Still, I could never get angry. She was always so fey, full of mad dishy fun. No wonder we became such great chums. Neither of us spoke in the conventional way. At parties, she was front for my back talk. Joan was the original give until it hurts girl. If she wasn't paying some faded star's debts, she was taking care of an extra's hospital bill. Then there was her mother, father, brother, and sister. They all came first. Anyone could have her last nickel, and some took it. While lunching with Joan in the studio green room, the stately Kay Francis entered, wearing a white jersey evening gown I had designed for the picture Another Dawn. The neckline was a first for the screen, or anywhere else for that matter. Its narrow V-neck slid to her waist. Like bubbles in a stein of beer, Miss Blondell's eyes almost bubbled out of their sockets at the daring neckline on the elegant K. Joan could turn night into day, and did the moment my back was turned. After lunch, on the soundstage, she called for Cora, her wardrobe woman, to fetch her the scissors. She slashed the modest neckline of her street dress down to her navel. Not satisfied, she made a spread eagle out of a couple of rhinestone clips and opened up her below the waistline. Then, for an added touch of color, she tucked in a rosebud to cover her button, and off she went to the corner store for a loaf of bread and a sack of potatoes the script called for. At the preview, I wanted to hide under my seat when I saw how Joan had turned a day dress into a night dress. I need to see that dress. Is that movie still? Does that movie still exist? I need to see that. But it just sounds like something she might do, to be honest. I mean, not that I knew her, but judging even by just her characters that she played. The next Hollywood star whose description we are about to read is Dolores Del Rio, who was a Mexican actress that made it big in Hollywood in the 20s and 30s. And then when her career was declining in the 40s, she came back to Mexico and had a successful film career there as well. Another well-rounded figure was the ultra-sophisticated, yet still a little girl, Dolores Del Rio. She came from good stock. Her mother, constantly at her side, took Dolores on her 16th birthday to Spain and had her presented at court. She had the curried look of a pedigree filly. She was the first in the movie colony to own a modern house with all-white decor. I shall never forget the day I draped her naked figure in white jersey. She wanted no underpinnings to spoil the line. When I finished draping her, she became a Greek goddess as she walked close to the mirror and said, "It is beautiful." Taking a few steps closer and gazing into the mirror, she said in a half-whisper, "Jesus, I am beautiful." The Jesus was said with reverence. Narcissus, maybe. But she spoke the truth. She was unbelievably beautiful. And then he goes on to describe Barbara Stanwyck, who again, some of you may know, some of you may not know. She was in movies such as Double Indemnity or Christmas in Connecticut. Anyway, in contrast, when the talented down-to-earth Barbara Stanwyck came to that same fitting room, she usually wore a short leather jacket, a sweater, and a shirt. She had wonderful skin, no makeup, no to-do of any kind, and at this period no enthusiasm about her clothes. There was something sad and melancholic about this really nice girl. So many in this business go from love to stardom, but seldom can they find the road back from stardom to love. If ever a girl deserved love, Barbara did. She had the love of the crew with whom she worked, but that isn't enough. I never delved into Barbara Stanwyck's love life, so I wonder what he means when he says that. But I always feel bad when they describe people that they've met, like famous people, and they just say that they were unhappy. Like, I wouldn't want that to be the thing that people remember about me. Then he goes on to describe Ginger Rogers, which is probably much more familiar with most of you. She was an actress and a dancer, mostly known for her duets with Fred Astaire. So he describes her at the beginning of her career. Few teenagers had the figure of Miss Ginger Rogers. I dressed Ginger in some of those early Warner musicals. She loved to do imitations of other stars in the fitting room. Tiger-eyed, squaring her mouth and shoulders, she would go into her favorite routine. Flattening herself against the wall and slinking up to the mirror, she would give a devastating impression of the big Hollywood star, singing My Melancholy Baby. But in those days, her personal clothes had the touch of loving hands. It was Irene, the designer, who first took her in hand and gave her good taste in clothes. Later, her head severely coiffed, simply and elegantly dressed by Jean-Louis, she was a far cry from the early days when she played opposite Joe E. Brown and Alan Farina Hoskins. This is so interesting. I had no idea Ginger Rogers didn't know how to dress at first. It also says that her mom and Mervyn Leroy, who was a director-producer, helped her basically dress at first. And she apparently had a crush on Mervyn, and she then found out that he's getting married to Harry Warner's daughter. Another one is a description of Jean Harlow, who I would say was like the Marilyn Monroe of the 30s. She had a very short career because of her untimely death, but she was like a visual symbol of the era. So a lot of women were inspired by just simply the image of her. And here is what he says about that image and Jean in general. I remember so well the original platinum blonde Jean Harlow wearing a white fringed evening gown. Her escort was William Powell, who had left her with me while he joined the Richard Bartle messes. Like all femme fatale, Jean was never completely happy. While we were sipping champagne, she said, "Now watch this." She pointed to a female star who had sidled up to a couple of top box office male stars. Now, if I were to join that little group, Jean smiled, their wives would be on my neck. Just then, the other star left. I said, "Well, there's your chance to prove it." With an impish twinkle, Jean sashayed her fringe over to the reigning king of the box office and his chum. Sure enough, a few yards away, I saw his plump wife nudge her companion, and simultaneously, they turned and called, "Don't you think it's time we joined the others?" Jean threw her hands in the air. "What did I tell you?" she laughed. Jean Harlow's platinum pulchritude gave her the look of a shimmering white aigrette. Poet and novelist Gabriele D'Annunzio claimed few women could stand up to a greyhound. Jean Harlow had what he described of the perfect breed: a small head, a swan's neck, a stomach like a lyre, and long, nervous legs. It is interesting, but also a little sad that a lot of these descriptions are about women's physical appearance, which, like, I get. He was a visual man. He was a designer. He worked with women's bodies. So that makes a lot of sense. But also, is that all that you remembered about the person? The fact that Jean Harlow had legs like a greyhound? But he also does mention other stories, like the one with trying to make other wives jealous. But then he brings up Marlene Dietrich, and it's not in the context you would think that he would bring her up. Marlene Dietrich, the bird of paradise, had all that the great Don Juan described, and legs that not even a greyhound could stand up against. Yet Marlene, the world's most glamorous and exciting woman, refused to let any man clip her wings, regardless of his wealth. She possessed few jewels. Freedom was her pearl of great price. This is a description that is different to the other ones that he makes, and I wonder if he actually knew her or if he's just like saying what other people said, because not only is this not very specific, but also she was married for like most of her life. So I don't know what he means about her like being free and not letting a man clip her wings. Granted, it was an open marriage, but still. Here's an interesting anecdote about Bette Davis. In 1942, I designed Now Voyager, and although she looked well in Dark Victory, clothes-wise I think it was Bette Davis's best picture. The tiny waist, broad shoulders and small bodice of the pre-Civil War period of the Old Maid showed off Betty's neck, shoulders and bosom. Her feminine figure always looked so well in the Victorian period. In fact, there was something almost Victorian about her behavior at times. Betty and I didn't agree on some of the more dressy evening things. In fact, during 3 different fittings, they hung on the hanger without being tried on. Each time we fitted, I told my cutter-fitter Miss Keedy to bring in the gowns and hang them on the rack. And each time Betty looked at them, as if to say, "What, are those things still here?" She was in one of her moods all that week. I flew to the bottle, and my hangovers didn't help either. I think it's important to note at this point that Orry-Kelly was an alcoholic, and that was also the reason of his death in 1965, I think. So quite early, like he wasn't super old. The following Monday was the final fitting. Betty arrived looking like the old Betty I knew. The tormented look was gone. Without saying a word, she examined the evening dresses she'd ignored all the previous week. "Let's try that one." She indicated a cream wool dinner dress with bugle beads of streak lightning. It was for a strong dramatic scene. She tried it on, it looked great. "And that one," she cried, pointing to a white chiffon evening dress with a red wool cape with a butterfly motif embroidered over the shoulder. When the fitting was over, she turned to me and said, "Kelly, I've been a devil this last week, haven't I? I've been almost out of my mind. My sister Barbara has been terribly ill." That's the way Betty was with everyone. It made up for everything. It didn't matter if I jumped in my sleep all week or that I was hitting the bottle. I didn't need an excuse for that. In the end, she was always so fair and considerate. Again, it's one of those stories that, considering her characters, it kind of makes sense that she could have been bossy at times, but then she would always apologize after. Like, that's exactly what I would expect her to do. This was probably still annoying. Like, I don't really like when people take it out on other people and then they're like, "Oh, I was having a really bad time, I'm sorry." Like, the harm's already done. I'm already in a bad mood as well. But still, it's good that she apologized instead of just being a diva. So it clearly worked for him. Then there is a brief mention of Ingrid Bergman on set of Casablanca. Casablanca starred Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart. Miss Bergman was the most unactressy of all the actresses I have dressed. Off the screen, she wore simple peasant-style skirts and blouses, and always low heels, even with evening dresses. She wore no makeup, her lovely face didn't need it. The one request she made was to have her hair dressed on the set. She disliked listening to the gossip in the makeup department. Oh, that's what he means. So she would be getting her hair dressed up on set, as in not in the makeup room. That's interesting. When she wasn't attending to details concerning the picture, it was Miss Bergman's home and mainly her daughter that seemed to be her chief interest. I was putting her into a white dinner dress on the soundstage one day and checking for last-minute changes. The playback machine was playing As Time Goes By. Bogart's voice came on saying, "Play it, Sam." Then the song came on again. "The world will always welcome lovers." I can see the lovely alive face of Miss Bergman now, smiling and saying, "What a lovely theme." Again, it's one of those stories that you read and knowing what her roles were like, you're just like, yeah, that makes sense. Not even the roles, but just the energy that the actress emits, I would say. Like, we all assume things about people judging by how they behave, even if it's on screen, even if they're playing someone else. And so far, a lot of those assumptions are true. Like, the vibe that someone is giving off, even at work, even playing someone else, are very often compatible with what they were like in real life, which I find really interesting because I usually tend to remind myself that actors and actresses are completely different in personal life, and I would never know what they're like until I meet them. But here it seems that not only were my assumptions correct, but also that it's difficult to hide a person's personality and character so well that it would be completely different to what you see on screen. Like, it somehow always comes out on screen as well. Now, the opposite of that is how he describes Rita Hayworth, because the way he describes her is so different from what we see on screen and what we would assume about her as a person. So here's what he says. Rita Hayworth appeared in The Strawberry Blonde with Olivia de Havilland and James Cagney. She was always professional, prompt, very quiet, and almost shy in those days. Later on, when she was married to Orson Welles, I dined with her at Cole Porter's. She reclined on the couch, content to listen. For someone who had been so well publicized, Rita couldn't have been more unassuming. Jean-Louis later made her many beautiful creations, mostly strapless evening gowns. There was no padding used in Miss Hayworth's clothes. She needed none. As the party broke up early one morning, Luella Parsons came into her playroom saying, "Would somebody be good enough to take Rita Hayworth home? She came alone." Two things that are insane here. First of all, can someone take care of Rita Hayworth? Because she's kind of shy, guys. And second of all, The fact that he's like, yeah, we didn't have to use any padding on her, unlike we did on other stars, which makes me think like how much padding was used in evening gowns and dresses of other actresses that was not used on her. Like, was that the norm to just pad someone's bosom and hips and like they did in the Edwardian era? Was that customary? I'm going to be a little suspicious now watching old Hollywood movies. Like, is that actually your figure, or did you get some help from the designer? But also, speaking of Olivia de Havilland, here's a very interesting excerpt on working with her. He mentions that she spent a lot of time playing in period dramas, and then when Olivia was cast opposite Leslie Howard in Modern Clothes, I then began dressing her. What a difference between her and her sister Joan Fontaine. They were direct opposites. Olivia was kind, considerate, sincere, loyal, and full of charm. I dressed Miss Fontaine as the young girl in The Constant Nymph. On screen, she was charming. This is all he says. He not once said that she was rude to him. He not once said that she was a bitch. He just describes Olivia and he says that she was kind, considerate, blah, blah, blah. And then he's like, yeah, Miss Fontaine was charming on screen. This is such shade. Like, you can tell this man was bisexual because there ain't no way. And also knowing what we know nowadays about the feud between the sisters, and we know other reports of how difficult Joan Fontaine was to work with, it's actually so funny. Then he goes on to describe working with Betty Grable, and it's also not quite what you expect, but here's what he says. I found Betty Grable more interested in her husband, her children, and her race horses than in motion pictures. Of all the people I've dressed, she had less enthusiasm about the making of a movie itself. Not that she didn't have her mind on her work. The moment she was on the set, she turned in a good job. She was professional and considerate with everyone concerned. And let's face it, no one had more beautiful gams or a cuter chassis than Grable. Chassis being the French term for... I'm assuming it's a euphemism for her ass. I could be wrong though. Towards the end of filming Mother Wore Tights, Betty's pregnancy became obvious. Musicals take a long time to make. The dance numbers were all shot at once, as soon as she became aware of her condition. Luella O. Parsons, of course, was the first to know. So Luella Parsons was, he describes her as the first woman motion picture reporter. While I've always made it a point never to tell personal or production secrets to Luella or anyone else, now and then, being a good friend, Lolly would pump me when she thought she had a hot story. In fact, word got around that Betty might have the baby at any minute. One morning, Miss L.O.P., so Luella O. Parsons, called. I hear they're standing by to take Betty to the hospital. Not wanting to be scooped by an afternoon paper, Lolly in her vague manner continued, I hope she can hold off until the morning edition. Honestly, Betty Grable just sounds like a healthy person. Like, she was able to differentiate between her job and film set and her family life, which she considered her priority. So is that really such a bad thing to do? He also describes working with Ava Gardner. He definitely is taken by her beauty. I mean, he is taken by a lot of women's beauty, but there is something about the way that he describes her. Ava had something of a Greek coin beauty. Her swan-like neck emerges from her shoulders in much the same manner as the young Ethel Barrymore of the Sargent drawing. Draping Ava's naked body in white jersey for one touch of Venus. I'd never seen nipples tilted like hers. Then he says something very, very questionable. So years earlier, he visited Tahiti and he describes some history of Gauguin's visits in Tahiti. And as we know, Gauguin did questionable things, including basically abusing a 13-year-old girl and leaving her pregnant with his son. Anyway, he says, so he did speak of Ava Gardner's nipples. He said, I'd never seen nipples tilted like hers. And then he says, except perhaps on 12 or 13-year-old Samoan beauties. My dude, these are not beauties. These are literal kids. This is like the only disgusting part of this memoir that I'm like, my guy, this is criminal. Anyway, he goes on to say, okay, we're going to have to shake it off because there is several other quotes that I want to read. But yeah, let's keep that in mind for a second. But moving on, don't believe all you might have read about her being Ava Gardner. She may have been tactless in some of her interviews. She happened to be honest and outspoken. And let's face it, with all that beauty, the hags were bound to hag. Early in her career, I met her once for coffee before going shopping. I was giving my usual advice to young players. And another thing, I said, if you ever go out with that multi-millionaire, get a diamond bracelet first, for he is notorious for wanting people to like him for himself. You're a bit late with that, the luscious Ava smiled back at me. He's already given me a Cadillac, she sighed. But we had a spat. It was towed off yesterday morning. Another actress where he's like, don't believe everything you read about her, here is what she was really like, is Joan Crawford. So he says, if you hear someone say that Joan Crawford, with all her success, wealth and glory, was a very unhappy girl, don't you believe it. Joan Crawford was never even bruised, much less hurt. She saw to that when she shed her cocoon and spun the golden web. From the very beginning, she would stop at nothing if it meant furthering her career. And she herself became her career. To achieve success meant complete dedication, a great deal of study and years of hard work. Crawford swam and exercised every bone in her body. The beautiful bone structure of her face made her one of the world's most talked about women, at least over the longest period. Joan Crawford spent a fortune on clothes. She had a personal dressmaker on her payroll. She bought the finest fabrics, brocades, and embroideries, but somehow, maybe by intention, she dressed for the taste of her multitude of fans. The same fans she continued to inform about her whereabouts, the time she would leave her apartment, what theater she would attend, what street she would walk, what nightclub she would be in, even what was cooking and what have you. Her fans copied and demanded her Letty Linton sleeves. She squared her mouth and the mouths of many other screen personalities. It became a worldwide vogue from the time her waistline was lower than Ward Bonds in Wagon Train, but it took Kay Kendall in just one picture, Le Girls, to wipe it off the screen with her Gainsborough Cupid's bow lips. What he is referring to is a fashion trend that Joan Crawford started in 1940s, which was overlining her lips on the sides of the upper lip. Instead of accentuating the Cupid's bow, she overlined the outer edges of her upper lip, if that makes sense. So if you look at photos of her from 1940s, 1950s, you would understand what I'm saying. And it was a trend that lived well until like mid-1950s. So a lot of actresses, a lot of women would overline their lips that way. Lucille Ball had a similar lip shape. There is also a really nice description of Merle Oberon. Whatever her origin, it was inevitable that Miss O'Brien, so that was her actual name, would become Miss Oberon, the international beauty and movie star. She belonged in the big world. Her almond-shaped face was one of a kind. Her jewels were fabulous. She owned the Empress Josephine emerald and diamond necklace, which seemed so at home on her throat. I saw her wear other diamond necklaces, 2 at a time, and on Merle they seemed right, while on someone else they would look vulgar. Everything she did seemed to be to the manner born. Everything about her had been carefully planned. Her poise, her dignity, her manner of speech. And topping it all, she had the most devastating charm. I felt the grand old lady of English poetry, who looked like a Spanish conquistador, was searching within the beautiful Merle. Narrowing her piercing eyes, she seemed to be thinking, someone with so much must have a secret barricaded deep in her soul. Maybe the great dame was wishing she could trade actual experience with Merle instead of having to write about her own emotional problems. What is he saying? Anyway, he's clearly impressed by her. Anyway, these are all the anecdotes that we are reading today. I just find it really interesting how he compares those people. And even though he's really honest, he rarely is actually rude about anyone. Like, he did read Joan Fontaine to filth, but he rarely ever speaks negatively of someone, like clearly in a negative way. Like, sometimes he would say that some behaviors were interesting. He never says outrightly that someone was just a bad person. So considering how many people he must have worked with, met in his whole entire career, I do find it impressive that he managed to stay polite, because I'm assuming there must have been some really, really difficult people to work with. And he either just chose to omit those people and just not mention them, or he purposely described them nicer than they deserved it, which I think is very commendable, because if I was him publishing this book in the 60s, back when cancel culture was not really a thing, you could write anything about anyone, and as long as they didn't sue you, you could basically just smear anyone you'd like. So being able to refrain from that, even though he probably had beef with a lot of those people, is, I think, commendable. But also, yeah, it's clear that he had admiration for women, that he liked working with women. He enjoyed the visuals, but he also enjoyed their characters. He did find like star qualities in most of them. It's those qualities, I think, that he describes that just sound very foreign to me, because I cannot imagine any of the modern actresses of modern stars being described in that way. I think it's just that we have too much information, we have too many interviews, we have too much content regarding the people that are on screen nowadays, and it's just not as mysterious anymore. You can't be mysterious. You can't just make up your biography like Paula Negri did and pretend you're like a countess, a Russian countess or someone, because someone will fact check this and then you're cancelled. So I think being a star must have been much more mysterious back then, simply because, yeah, obviously there was gossip, there was speculation, but at the end of the day, you knew nothing about that person until you actually met them. And you got very little information, very little content, and very little material to work with, which I think built the mystery and the legend status of a lot of those people. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. I definitely have a couple of new movies on my watch list now, and I will be checking out those actresses just to compare them on screen and to the description that he's given us. Because even though it's subjective, even though it was his personal thoughts, I mean, there must be some truth in it, especially if it's people that we know were described in a similar way by someone else, by other people that knew them. So I'm off watching classic Hollywood movies now, and I'll see you or hear you in the next episode. Bye.